tuning in to PopGoesAlicia, Talk to Me About Feminism. This is our pilot number 2, and my guest today is Jason David Scott, who is currently a visiting assistant professor at Arizona State University. And welcome to the show, Jason.
Thanks, Alicia.
So happy to be talking to you on the phone.
Yes, and not that this matters very much at all, but I am no longer a visiting assistant professor. I am actually a regular assistant professor. So
okay,
my title has changed.
Excellent. So you are permanent in Arizona currently.
Well, permanent for the moment, like all of us. Yes.
And so, just give us a brief little bio so our listeners know who you are.
Okay. Well, my undergrad degree was in cinema studies from NYU. And after that, I was in show business for a while doing public relations and also feature film development. And then I went back to school and I got my master's and my PhD in theater from UC Santa Barbara. And I taught at a couple places, but now I am at, as you said, ASU, where I teach both theater and film in the School of Film, Dance, and Theater on our main campus in Tempe.
Awesome. So what we're doing on the podcast, it's real casual. My goal is to just have conversations with people about feminism. And I'm starting off with people I have relationships to that I also know have something of a relationship to feminism, although that's not where I'll be limited. And so last week I started with my guest, Krista Atkinson, and I think I want to do the same thing and just kind of ask you, do you have a recollection or a specific memory of like the first time you heard the word feminism or your kind of first like introduction to the world of it, the word, what have you?
Sure. I don't remember a time when the word wasn't in my consciousness. So it's certainly, and part of that is probably, growing up in the 70s with two parents who were pretty progressive. They were journalists and professional writers. And I know for a while that my mom subscribed to Ms. Magazine. So that's probably the first evidence of cultural feminism that I can remember. And so the idea of there was a lot of debate about the Equal Rights Amendment, and just sort of, the increasing cultural visibility of feminism is something that I remember being conscious of the same way I was conscious of probably gay rights, civil rights, less so about Vietnam because I was a little too young when that war was going on. It's just sort of the way that political discourse was occurring. My parents watched the news every night. They would talk about it a little bit, and I would ask them questions. So it was just part of cultural consciousness was being conscious of key feminist concepts like equality, equal opportunity, and just the discussion of what those terms mean and how they function.
Sure. So it sounds, and correct me if I'm wrong, that your experience with it initially was generally positive, or at least in a somewhat educational type of setting where your parents were open to talking about it. Like you said, the word was around, you had a familiarity with it, and it was just sort of almost this thing you were learning about.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in a very positive way. Both of my parents, at different points in time in my childhood, worked full time. Both of them cared for me full time. I never thought when my mother was picking up extra work, sometimes it was cleaning people's houses and sometimes it was, writing professional articles for people. My mom, when I was younger, she ghost wrote a religious woman's autobiography. So there was a sort of and this is while my dad was in, working in the entertainment industry. And, again, very conscious of sort of, extended Southern California liberal, kind of consciousness about social issues. And they certainly weren't, I would never call my parents activists in any way, but they never avoided the discussion by any means.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that you do identify as a feminist. It's a word that you're comfortable owning. Do you identify as a feminist?
Oh yeah, I would have it tattooed on my forehead. That's really creepy. No,
you can get it tattooed
absolutely.
somewhere else.
I probably could. No, absolutely, and I always say that with saying understanding that that's a very complicated term, and it's, you have to start say, well, what kind of feminist are you? And so I like to think that I'm generally all kinds of feminist, because I like to try to appreciate and articulate all of those points of view, whether I'm teaching or in my writing. And at times it's more appropriate than others, but I think I consider myself an active feminist. I try to call out my colleagues when I see things that I find problematic. I try to talk to my students about issues. I try to be really, really sensitive to my own position as a male person in a very male-dominated field, both entertainment and teaching film, which is very dominated by men, at least where I am. So it's an extended part of my consciousness. It's more about how I behave and how I listen to others than so much is what I specifically believe should or shouldn't happen in terms of social policy or things like that.
Right. Yeah. So you touched on a lot of things there, and that's really part of the goal of this podcast, is to just open up these dialogues around feminism, and especially for people who may, not feel like they can identify or don't feel feminist enough. There's, like you said, there's lots of different ways to be a feminist. And so one of the things, do you have like a sort of like, kind of elevator pitch definition of like feminism, or what kind of feminist you are? I mean, is there like a quick and easy way you say it when someone asks, or?
This is not a perfect answer by any means.
That's great. Even better.
One of the things I say is people say, well, what does that mean to you? And it's like,
right.
Well, it really just means I'm what we might call a humanist.
Sure.
It really has nothing to, I know it has nothing to do with gender. Obviously, it has to do with the way that we filter our experience of the world through the idea of gender. But it's not about sort of saying one gender is this and one gender is that, or even having that discussion as much as it is. Everybody has a kind of equal value and worth. And, to me, being a feminist is one way to actively recognize that value and worth. And, it's feminism allows us to ask questions of, how can we treat people, how do we understand people who are different from us in their bodies or in their beliefs? Mm-hmm. And how do we live with that difference? How do we negotiate that difference? How is that difference constructed? How is it performed? Those are questions that people are always asking themselves. Feminism just kind of does it around this prism of gender, which is, to me, where I feel like I can contribute the most to the conversation, because I am also a gendered person. Right. Other people like to have that conversation around race or class or religion or preference. And all of those, I think they're the same conversation. Yeah. So to me, feminism is just an extension of, kind of certainly the Western, progression of philosophy that sort of increasingly sees human beings as of equal potential worth, regardless of their differences from each other. Sure. I think that was the perfect answer. Well, thank you. Well, one of the things you mentioned, and if you can think about a specific example, I mean, you mentioned just calling out colleagues, like in moments where you feel that something is problematic. And I think that is a big part of people trying to figure out, like, I call it kind of how to like live their feminism, how to kind of just do it in their everyday life. And I think that's also a place where people tend to get
nervous. Like, if I call myself a feminist, then what kind of responsibility am I then taking on? And, am I prepared to do that? So I wonder if you can think of a particular moment or a sort of maybe a common kind of issue that you see that comes up. I say with your colleagues, but I'm curious about your students too, so we can either, switch gears or.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you one example of each, and one that, where I am a hero, and one where I am perhaps not. The one was an issue where I was in a room full of male colleagues, and we were discussing students who had applied for a specific sort of program, and we were debating them. And one colleague made an inappropriate comment about a female student, but wasn't specifically directed at the student. It was kind of a general sexualized comment.
Right.
So it wasn't even like super creepy or super personal. It was just one of those kind of boys being boys things, where he kind of allowed an innuendo to extend beyond, oh my God, he just did an innuendo. He made sort of a big, am I right kind of joke about it. And I got very angry very quickly. And I said, unacceptable, not good, do not do in front of me ever again. It's never appropriate, to just kind of abstractly sexualize, particularly a student who had come in, applying for something, And I was so angry, and he got a little bit defensive at first, and was, I think, taken aback by my passion. And I got so angry, I said, I'm just going to walk out of the room for a minute, and I'll come back and we can discuss this later if we need to. But that's how sort of angry I was. And I'm not somebody who gets, I'm somebody who gets passionate, certainly, but I do not get, I do not sort of lash out that way and show a temper. I will say since then, although the colleague didn't apologize, I think he knew instantly, what he had done. But he has since shown a lot of respect and sort of more sensitivity around me, and not in any way that sort of reflects some kind of, I guess I have to.
Right.
It seems to be that I genuinely sort of made a difference by saying, like, even that level is just not something in a room full of what I presume are straight white men.
Right.
Like, I can't stand for that.
Right.
And those are the kind of comments that for years, being in locker rooms around guys or whatever, just always made me sick.
Yeah.
Regardless of the humor in the comment, or the nature of it, or whether the guy was just talking about a girlfriend that he loved very much, there was something that always felt very inappropriate about that to me.
Yeah.
The other instance is something I'm still sort of processing, and it has to do with the class I teach, which is a class on sex and violence in cinema and the ethics of representation. And this is a class where I try to bend over backwards to not only sort of identify my feminist, leanings and bring in a lot of feminist theory. And this is a lower division undergraduate class, so it can't get too heavy in theory, but to sort of really kind of, positively portray, a feminist and queer approach to this material, because I think it's the most interesting and compelling one intellectually. And one of the things that I do is when I talk about sex, and I talk a little bit about pornography, I have pictures and slides. And I got a comment back among, a lot of very, very positive comments about how people felt that the dialogue was always safe, and that the comments were always positive, and that I was very sympathetic to everyone's point of view. That one student made a comment that said some of the women felt he was sexist because he censors images of male genitalia, but doesn't censor images of female genitalia in the pictures that I show.
Interesting.
And I'll have to go back and look at them specifically, because I thought that I was censoring all, genitalia, with the exception of one image, which I'll talk about in a second. And so I have to go back and look and see, did I just not sort of see that bias?
Mm-hmm.
I know that I block male genitalia because that's something that I find it's a very sort of aggressive and assertive thing to show.
Mm-hmm.
And people can use their imaginations if there's a black box over something. I don't need to show them that in a classroom situation.
Right.
But I'm sort of wondering, did I sort of subconsciously, am I communicating something in that? Am I communicating something different by showing images of topless women without sort of, bars in strategic places? So one of the ways that I'm addressing that next semester is I'm going to let the students decide at the beginning of the semester, and they'll vote on what they think is appropriate. And we can have a little discussion about it, because ultimately, it's not going to upset anybody if I cover some things up more than I should. Everybody understands it's a classroom situation.
Right.
The one exception that I have, and I'm wondering if this is what the students were referring to, is that at one point in time I show a fully nude image of the trans performer Buck Angel, who identifies as a man with a vagina. And it's very important that they see that what that image looks like of a male body with a vagina. So I was wondering if maybe that was the image that was sticking out to these students.
Interesting.
And what a complicated idea it is that is a female vagina or a male vagina, and somehow that maybe that's what they're remembering. But again, I have to look, because it struck me, and it certainly was something that's like, well, I don't want that perception that I'm sexist and I'm just showing pictures of naked women. That's not. That's certainly not the intention of the class, even though, yes, I am showing pictures of all kinds of naked bodies for these particular lectures.
How have you seen, because you've been in academia for a good amount of years.
Sure.
I mean, I guess what I mean is, it sounds like you've been in, educational spaces.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you've observed any shifts sort of in your students, or in, kind of this youth relationship to feminism, because it's certainly been more in the narrative in the last year or two, especially around these kind of pop cultural moments.
Yes.
And, I'm just curious, I'm just curious what your relationship with your students and their relationship to feminism has been, and if you've, seen, kind of differences here or there, or from this year to this year, or
Yes, of course.
And you're in a different part of the country, because you were on the East Coast for a while, right? And then you were West Coast, East Coast, now you're in Arizona.
Yeah, well, my educational experience has been, and especially sort of focusing on these issues, has been in California and Arizona.
Okay.
There's three classes I can sort of point to that cover the space of time. The last class I took as a graduate student is the History of Pornography class at UC Santa Barbara, which is taught by Constance Penley, who's one of the top sort of late feminist, pro pornography, but, not anti-pornography scholars. And she's published a number of books on the subject, and is a really awesome person. So that was the first chance that I had to sort of be around undergraduates sort of confronting these issues, through the lens of pornography as well as images of sexual violence. The class that I'm now teaching, I first taught about 4 years ago, I guess, when the other teacher was on sabbatical. And now that professor has left, I've just taught it again. So I have those two classes as an experience as well. In that time, which covers, I guess, about 10 years, in general, I'm certainly seeing that when it comes to matters of more on the queer studies side of feminism, that students are much more comfortable having those conversations and embracing those conversations as part of who they are. So when I talk about sexual fluidity or gender fluidity, when I taught it this time, I had 4 young women after class come up to me and all thank me like specifically for talking about that as an issue. I certainly see even in young, very straight identifying men, much more of a tolerance for representations of gay male contact or romance or things like that. They don't make the same kind of noises. You don't feel them shrink in their seats a little bit, like this is something that's just so crazy to them. So that's certainly where I see a lot of influence. And again, because I'm teaching in that area, I'm going to notice it a little more there. But I've also just sort of seen a general sense in terms of young women talking about social issues that are related to women. The issue of birth control, the issue of access. I taught in a small town in a very conservative part of Texas, and I was surprised that there, even the very, very conservative religious girls, would identify as pro-choice, because they were never going to have to worry about making that choice, but they knew that they had friends that would. They would never, ever think about taking contraception until they were married, but they don't want their other friends to get pregnant.
Right.
So those are the kinds of arguments or positions where I think we've moved from a generation where you kind of inherited your parents' sort of core beliefs about those issues of sexuality and identity, to now sort of saying, I am what I am, what other people are shouldn't count against them.
Right.
And that kind of progress, I think, is very significant, and I think has a lot to do, again, with that feminist tinged discussion and perspective. And it means that it's not just happening in people's homes, but it is kind of happening in the classroom, and it is happening in social media. I was in Texas when the Monet Davis filibuster was going on.
Right.
And there were, probably 7 or 8 young women who were at a play rehearsal who were online with me, on their phones, wanting to know what was going on. And we were all, I was sort of updating them and sort of walking them through the procedural things that were happening, because they were stuck at rehearsal and they wanted to feel like they were part of this really significant event. And again, these are some young women who I know come from liberal backgrounds. They're all theater people, so they're all, kind of open-minded people, but also some that I know come from very, very conservative backgrounds, and this was a very important discussion for them. So I generally see more acceptance of the issues. Now, the funny thing is there's still very much a resistance about calling it feminism,
right,
or calling it a feminist issue. And
sure.
So the idea of redefining or reclaiming that word is something that's very appealing to me, with the caveat that I think as long as the discussion is happening, as long as feminism is working, then I can't get too worried about always having to remind people that it's feminism that's doing the work. I think the work is more important than the word is.
Sure. I think I agree with that in theory, but I think because I feel so connected to the word, and it took me a long time to find the word, and I agree, I feel like I've always been a feminist before I even knew the word existed, because I came from, my mom was I always thought very liberal, and looking back and looking at the world now, I realized that, especially she comes from a traditional Italian family, East Coast. She was a single mom. She was always, as I saw her, I always saw her making choices in her best interest and always trying to push towards her right to a self-determined life. But I never heard her call herself a feminist. I never heard that word. I didn't hear the word until I was in academia. And I remember being like, oh my God, there's a word for this? I can label myself something? Great. And then I got to grad school and started reading feminist theory, and I kind of went the other way. I started thinking, oh, well, shit, maybe I'm not a feminist, because you know, some feminist theory can be very radical. Some of it can be, I feel, a little bit alienating just from the sense of, you know, you have to think or do or act this way in order to, you know, be a feminist. And I think a lot of that also comes with just, you know, the human experience of getting to know yourself and becoming more aware and more confident in who you are and being able to stand strong in that no matter what. And that's certainly been a process of mine and continues to be, you know, over the years. But I do, you know, I do feel like agreed that the work is more important, but I am attached to the word. And I feel like I want people to call themselves feminists, you know, like I want people to say it. And one of the big reasons I've continued to claim the word, you know, in and out of my doubts and my changes with it is because I want people to look at me and go, oh, that is what a feminist looks like, or that is what feminism is. Like you can wear hot pants, you can, you know, date boys, you can, you know, whatever. I mean, those are just two examples from my life, but
no, and absolutely, and I think that's important. And the other thing is, it's not a zero-sum game. I mean, you know, both of these things sort of operate, and you know, I am in a position where it's in one way it's more complex for me to claim the title of feminist because I am not a woman. I don't have a woman's body, you know, and so therefore there's a different set of questions that goes along with the same kind of assumptions that go along. Well, if you're a woman feminist, it must mean that you are X, Y, and Z.
Right.
I think one of the things that I do think has evolved is that the more that we do see the concepts working and the questions being asked, and the more that we can, you know, personally and in between ourselves and sort of publicly sort of say, well, yeah, this is the product of feminist thought. This is the product of a feminist perspective. This is the product of feminist theory or feminism or however we want to label it. If we can do that, then, you know, it almost sort of doesn't matter what the previous era's historical definition of it has been.
Right.
You know, this is a term like all terms, humanist, you know, liberal, progressive, conservative, you know, Christian, secular.
Right.
You know, all of these terms evolve over time as these systems of power evolve over time. And obviously it behooves the people who identify with these words to claim them and proclaim them as much as they can. But I think, I think one of our key struggles as human beings is this struggle with language.
Yes.
And that, you know, while we proclaim, we shouldn't get too involved in sort of having to win the argument long term, because I think that's something that we can't control. I think if you claim that title today, if you claim that word and you put it into action, you know, that's going to speak more than whether or not you change 10 people's mind on what a feminist is or does.
Right.
You know, the actions that you put into place. And I think in a way that's kind of a core feminist value, is putting it into action rather than getting too wrapped up in the nomenclature.
Yeah, like I call it, you know, I went through a bit of a struggle with, you know, Beyonce as this feminist icon. And I kind of, for a minute, was kind of calling it Instagram feminism, you know, because, you know, people are, you know, and not just her, of course, she's just kind of one of the most recognizable, you know, quote unquote feminists in the culture right now. And when I first, you know, when it first started happening, and, you know, she did that Instagram of herself as Rosie the Riveter, and, you know, leaving out the whole fact that Rosie the Riveter is kind of this mistaken feminist icon, you know, that's not even really how that started. And for those of you listening, there's lots of articles out there right now about that, because when that photo circulated, you know, of course, some of the feminists were like, hey, P.S., Rosie the Riveter wasn't really, you know, that wasn't what that was about. But it doesn't change the fact that we still identify that image with it. So, you know, whatever. But, you know, so like I think what I was feeling initially was this frustration because I feel like I'm on the front lines, you know, like I'm in the trenches. Like I am fighting this feminist battle every day and oh my God, I'm like tearing up, like in every moment of my life. And then, you know, Beyonce gets to just put on a costume and take an Instagram, and now she's like Miss Feminist of the Year, you know?
Yeah.
But that brings up so many points, which is one, like, there's no need to judge someone else's feminism. And for me personally, there's no need for me to get tangled up in judging another woman. I mean, that for me is a big part of my feminism. I mean, it doesn't mean I have to like all women, which I certainly don't. There are plenty of just people in general I don't like, you know. But it means, like, it's not for me to say you're doing feminism wrong, quote unquote, you know.
Yeah.
And then, go ahead.
Well, and I was thinking, you know, if we look back on, you know, this kind of historical moment of, you know, Alicia versus Beyonce circa, you know, 2013 or whatever. No, but if we look back on that, there's the one way that we can look at it again and say, you know, where is the feminism here? It's like we're now living in a place and a time where a woman with your background and a woman with her background and all of the things that those convey, you know, sort of have this discussion. And it's not just those two women, it's a whole number of women that are having this discussion, that this discussion is visible, it's present.
Visible,
The debate is there.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, that these powerful and passionate, you know, people who care about this term, whether it's to appropriate it as kind of, you know, a commodity, you know, because it has a kind of value. In some other cases, you know, we hear about the celebrities who say, "Oh, I'm not a feminist because," you know, sort of rejecting it. Whatever value it has, it's now women having that discussion about it, and it's in a number of cases men with, you know, sensitivity to the discussion joining in and sort of saying, you know, that this is something that affects them as well. So this is a really kind of wonderful example of how, you know, feminism, social media, all these things that we, you know, that conservatives so often lament as sort of, you know, destroying the fabric of society, are knitting a new kind of fabric. You know, and it's a fabric that is, in a way, a little bit more decentralized. It's something that is a little less hegemonic. It's something that's a little less sort of, you know, linear and determined. And it's a lot more about, I think, how people have always lived their lives, where, you know, traditionally, you know, women are the repositories of this kind of emotional memory and this kind of discussion. And, you know, what do we do with our families? And it's the men who go out and, you know, sort of put those plans into action. We're seeing the mirror of that now reflected in, you know, popular culture and popular discourse, something that has been for so long just so controlled and dominated by men. Now everybody has a little piece of it. And I think without a feminist consciousness and without a consciousness obviously informed by race and class, then we're not equipped to have this discussion.
So one of the things, and this will lead me back to another question about just kind of your background, but there was a lot of, and this came up in my class this semester, and so we're both in academia in very different settings. So I teach in the inner city. I don't know. I teach in the downtown Chicago at one of the city colleges. So it's a public, you know, state-funded establishment. And I'm in the humanities department, and the classes I teach are intro humanities. So they don't even have like college writing prereqs, you know, like basically anyone can take the class, which I love. But you know, and you're in a you know, I'm
a step above that. I mean, ASU has a huge number of first-generation students. And a number of non-traditional students. But it's a giant number of students that we deal with. So
Yeah.
I probably have a much more diverse population than you do, but I face some of those same challenges, but not in the same proportion.
Yeah, and again, it's just a little different. But so what was coming up in my classroom this semester, because this was the first semester my media studies class was actually like listed as a gender studies class, and of course I always teach through a feminist lens and do teach with gender, but I think, you know, having it listed in the course catalog that way made me feel like, okay, like the kids aren't going to come in and be like pissed that they're learning, like they're coming in knowing, you know, so it just made me, and so we talked a little bit about, you know, the Beyonce VMA performance, and we talked about the kind of debate or the confusion around why is it okay to like sexualize yourself, or why is it okay that Beyonce has 20 female dancers behind her who you're only seeing their legs move, and you know, isn't that objectification, Miss Swiz? And you know, so the dialogue of course is fantastic, but I certainly don't feel that I've even quite got the full answer. So just kind of curious, like your thoughts on that, or what do you say to your students? I mean, we definitely talk about ownership. We talk about just choice, you know, Beyonce making the choice to use her body the way she wants to, as opposed to someone else making that choice for her.
Yes.
But what do you say to those types of questions?
Well, it's funny because in my, this was last year in my theater history class, and this is theater history from, you know, from the beginning of time to the 1600s was the topic of this class. And I started off by talking about what had just happened, which was Miley Cyrus on the VMAs with,
yes.
I always want to say Alan Thicke, but that'll just tell you how old I am, with Robin Thicke. And it had just happened like a week before, so I thought it was an interesting place to introduce, you know, the idea of ritual dance and performance as a kind of rite of passage. And I am not somebody who knows a lot about Miley Cyrus's actual, you know, career or anything. She's sort of a distant cultural figure for me. But one of the things that we got to very quickly was, you know, the controversy about it was, you know, who's doing the exploiting here, who's responsible. And I was particularly interested in a class full of, you know, young theater people, among which were a lot of young women, most of whom were actresses or designers, you know, and the variety of opinion that we got in terms of, you know, everyone agrees that it was her rights to exploit herself that way or to perform that way. But there was also some questions about whether it was appropriate or what message it was communicating, and they sort of wish that there was a more responsible sort of framing. Plus, it was just so weird with that giant bear thing. I mean, it's so odd to look at, you know. And my sort of comment was, well, what aren't we talking about? Right? Let's have that discussion, and then let's talk about what we're not talking about, which to me was the guy on the other end of this who's going along with it, you know, who's got this very troubling song about consent, you know, and that they're sort of mugging their way through this kind of big style. You know, to me, that was the interesting part of that conversation. But with all of those things, it's, I think, having gone to NYU at a time when there were a lot of very radical teaching assistants in my department, which I'm so grateful for, because I got the full hardcore queer activist, you know, late 80s, early 90s ACT UP perspective on the world, like literally probably the most radical perspective I can imagine. And so often for them was, you know, them getting us into conversations that they knew had no answer. You know, and really getting us passionate about trying to stake out a position, knowing that ultimately every position would be undercut because there is no absolute position to take on these issues because they're so complex.
Right.
I like engaging students in that process. I don't think I'm as aggressively antagonistic as maybe some of my mentors were. But I like sort of listening to the conversation at the end saying, look, you know, all we can do here about these things is have the conversation, and this isn't necessarily about convincing people. This isn't necessarily about being right or choosing sides or writing the historical record. This is about in a classroom space. This is about, can I articulate my position? Can I respond to other people's positions in a sensitive and productive way? And can we agree that there are these things that we need to keep talking about?
Right.
Because as long as we talk about it and we're listening to each other about it, we might not be actively addressing the problem, but we're dealing with our feelings about the problem. We're making things less mysterious. We're all agreeing that we're subject to these larger systems of power.
Right.
We all agree that language sometimes gets in the way, because we can see that we feel the same thing, but I have to call it this and you have to call it that.
Right.
Or we can see how our core values that, you might be a person who doesn't have very much faith in humanity and is always looking for the worst.
Mm-hmm.
And by articulating that position critically, and maybe that's a legitimate position given your experience with the world, but by articulating it sort of critically and intelligently, you're giving somebody else insight into your nihilism. And you're actually opening up, and you're accepting them by giving them that offer. So I think that framing that discussion in any kind of positive way where people are talking about it and feel comfortable talking about it is a great thing that we can do as educators. And again, I think as feminists, if it's about, treating everybody, equally and respectfully, not just under the law, but in our own being, then this is how we put that into practice.
Yeah. Roxane Gay, who's a huge Beyonce fan, wrote a great article about 2 months ago on Alternet, and one of the lines from it in talking about, and she was just kind of talking about, the title of it is just basically they're not the feminists we need. It's great when celebrities embrace feminism, she says, but the movement is much more. But what I really like what she says is, Beyonce is one woman, but she's a gateway to feminism, not the movement itself. Which I just think is really important for people, to remember that there's, so much going on outside of just what you're seeing. And I mean, of course, that you can say that for anything in the media, that there's so much more going on beneath the surface than just what you're seeing.
And especially now, the illusion that we're seeing everything, is much more powerful because we do immediately get all these sort of different perspectives, and we do immediately sort of get all these different, different parties weighing in with their concerns. So it feels like we're getting more of the story, and maybe we are getting more of the story than we have in previous years, but it's still, it's still, somebody decided that was important and not this. Somebody just, this month, this year, and I say this with a little bit of cynicism, but suddenly we're concerned about young black boys getting shot.
Right.
Because this has been a problem for about 400 or 500 years in this country.
I love how
and so I'm so grateful that yes, it is now suddenly so visible, and I hope that it remains visible and that the problems get addressed. But that's just the part of the world that we're looking at now, and we're going to move on. We'll probably move on to something else at some point, and it's not going to minimize the impact. It's not going to take away things that the media wants to tell us that, oh, that's yesterday's news, but yesterday's news is still today's news. And if anything, that's what the internet reminds us of every day as well, that there is that kind of permanence there, so that the ripples are still going to happen, even when we move on to next week to rape culture, and the week after that to Ebola, and the week after that to Cuba, and the week after that to Seth Rogen bringing down the entertainment industry.
We're getting, I think we'll probably wrap up soon, but one thing I'm curious about, 2014 was a big year for feminism in the dominant narrative. You know, like we heard the word, we saw it, people were claiming it, there were all these conversations. Is there a moment that you felt was particularly important or that touched you specifically more, or that you really felt like when it happened you were like, oh, finally, or thank God? Let's hear it.
Yeah, and you're going to love this, but it's Monet Davis.
Yay!
Baseball is a great.
Yeah, you
mine.
love baseball.
I umpire Little League baseball in a very competitive part of the country. I work these postseason tournaments. I know how really, really good these kids who are playing at that level are. And I, over the 40 years of my life, I've seen girls here and there succeed at baseball, especially at the youth level. And then some of them go on to softball, some of them play baseball for a while. It's such a hard path to take, and it's going to be another generation before I think we see women playing professional baseball the way men are. But to see one girl happen to get lucky enough to get on the right team at the right time,
right,
to show that, because I've seen little girls pitch like that before.
Yeah.
I've seen I would say little girls. I mean, sometimes like I remember a 10-year-old girl in the Valley who's probably 4'2", who just she threw a perfect game when I was watching her pitch. I mean, beating throwing sliders past 12-year-olds who are 6 feet tall.
Right.
So it's to see that on that face and with that kind of poise and that kind of professionalism, and to see her very unself-consciously and in a very not programmed kind of way claim that for herself.
Yes.
Where she said, I want to be the first Monet Davis and things like that. Things that are, in a way, a little bit cliche, but for her to have the maturity and the focus to be able to sincerely kind of perform as herself.
Yes.
Not give in to sort of, doing more girly things or showing up in girly places, but just, and the cultural visibility of it, getting her, on the cover of Sports Illustrated as the kid sports person of the year, the ripples of that are going to be huge. And that was something that, watching, from a distance with so much passion, that's where I sort of said, this is why I am a feminist, and this is why feminism happens.
Yeah.
This is exactly the type of thing that hopefully we'll see more and more of, even if it remains exceptional for another generation.
Right.
It's something that's exceptional, that is joyous, and that should be celebrated sort of forever and ever.
Yeah, for sure. She's extra special to me because she's from Philly, and my dad's whole family is from Philly, and I'm a Philly sports fan. So it was just, it's so exciting for so many things. And then I think, you touched on a really good point. And this even goes back to kind of how we were saying about, this is the year we paid attention to Black men dying. It's not like, the fact that there's been so many examples, since Trayvon Martin, it's like, they're not just, it's not like this wasn't happening. And so the same thing with Monet Davis and all of these spaces where you consider access, that's one of my biggest frustrations when, people talk about like, well, if girls wanted to, why don't they just do it, or why aren't they just, if they were that good, they would be noticed. And it's like, no, dude, actually, and not even dude, no, whoever's saying that, like that's not the way it works. There's so many other outliers that go into it. So I really want to just like revisit, especially for our listeners, your mention of that she was on the right team, like at the right time, that she was in a space where she was given the opportunity to just be her, but that so many, in this particular case, young women athletes aren't even given that opportunity, or for whatever reason, the other struggles that keep you from embracing it. And so, that was really exciting. And like you said, it was positive. It was just so nice to like get excited about something that didn't feel complicated. You know, you're just like, watch her play. Like, there's no debate here, you know?
Yeah.
And my favorite part was all the boys, like, who would throw temper tantrums when they got struck out. Like, I just loved watching them, like, throw their bat down and stomp off. And I actually follow her on Instagram, and you should just see some of the horrible comments people are posting, just, like, on her pictures, calling her, like, a cocky bitch and stuff. And it's just, you know, I think that's, again, one of those things that is a little bit harder for men to be empathic to, just not that they're not, but it's just sometimes it's hard to really know what it's like to be a person constantly having to prove themselves, you know?
I can't. That's something that, you know, as I grow older and wiser, I keep trying to remind myself, you know, that I have, you know, I've succeeded, and I hope I've made the most of my opportunities, but you know, there was never a question about me being suitable for any of those opportunities, you know, just based on, you know, some kind of random biological accident.
Right.
You know, and, you know, it's only, you know, watching friends and hearing stories and opening up and listening to others and understanding, you know, again, that feminist, humanist impulse to sort of say, you know, making life better for myself isn't really much of a challenge. You know, how can I find ways to engage that allow other people to make a better life for themselves?
Yeah.
You know, and that's, you know, feminism started with, you know, a bunch of people, mostly women, but a few very important men too, sort of getting together and saying, you know, okay, we're going to take on the biggest problem, which is the fact that half of our culture, half of our society is just locked out.
Yeah.
And if we start opening up the gates there, that slowly over time we'll be able to address, you know, the 10% over here that are this color, and the 9% over here that are this, and the 13% that come from someplace outside these artificial lines that we've drawn. Right. You know, and that it's you know, that it's gender equality that I think starts that discussion historically, and has to adapt itself over time so that we can start to talk about, you know, all the other ways in which we can do better by, you know, lifting everybody up.
Well said. Bravo.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Well, this has been wonderful, and I think we're going to have you back on to talk more about porn. I didn't really want to open that can of worms because I know it's a huge conversation, and I'm not terribly versed in it myself, but I do think it's one a lot of people want to explore. But in the meantime, if you're listening and you're in the New Orleans area, Jason and I will be there with another one of our colleagues in April for the Pop Culture of America conference, where, we're doing a panel on Maleficent and Angelina Jolie and kind of what her place in this shifting feminism is and why it's important. Most people probably won't want to shell out the big bucks to go to the conference, but we'll be in the bars after, so come find us and buy us a drink on Bourbon Street.
You've promised me that you would do karaoke with me, so I'm looking forward to that.
You do not have to convince me to do karaoke. Well, thanks so much for joining us. And I know you're on the Facebooks. Are you on the Twitter? Do you have a public presence?
No, I'm at this point. I'm woefully socially inadequate, but I am working on starting a new online pop culture journal through the Mid-Atlantic Popular American Culture Association. So that will be debuting hopefully over the summer or late summer, early fall. And we'll let you know about that because we're hoping that that's sort of a really cool open access site for really thoughtful pieces by really qualified academics about issues related to pop culture.
Awesome. Well, we'll look forward to that, and I'll make sure to have all the information on the website at PopGoesAlicia.com. And in the meantime, enjoy your holiday break. When do you go back to class?
I think on the 12th of January. So I've got a few weeks In fact, I have to go buy Maleficent and start writing my paper for New Orleans.
Yes, me too. Join the club.
Yeah.
So we'll be talking. All right. Well, great to talk to you, friend.
All right. Thank you.
All right. See you later.
Talk to you, Alicia. Bye.
Thanks.